Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining today's session. Today, we'll continue with the series on labor market analysis, and this series is to help and support candidates preparing for the CIPM exams, Chartered Institute of Personnel Management exams. This is just our own little way of supporting and assisting students in their preparation. The last edition, in this journey on labor market analysis, I was able to speak to chapters 1, 2, and 3, and I will try today to cover additional chapters. Thank you so much for joining. And the next chapter is chapter 4, which speaks to wage determination. And we will be looking at how wages are set by the markets, the institutions, the process of negotiations, and the organizational realities. These are the critical objectives, learning objectives of this chapter. We need to be able to explain the meaning and the purpose of wage determination in labor market analysis. We want to be able to see and analyze how labor demand and labor supply also interacts to influence wage levels. We also want to be able to differentiate market-based wage setting from individual negotiation and also collective bargaining. We'll assess the purpose, reasons, and implications of minimum wage laws, and then how do we relate wage decisions to the economy and also the internal capability and capacity of the organization. So moving on very quickly, wage determination is the process by which the price of labor is established in an employment relationship. So when we talk about the price of labor now, okay, we're talking about salary, we're talking about compensation and benefits, we're talking about remuneration. All right. So that's what we mean by the price of labor, just for the benefit of one or two people who may wonder what that means. And wages may be set, by what we call market forces. In economics, market forces just means the interaction of demand and supply. In other words, people who need the services of labor and people who own the services of labor. And you know what typically happens? If many people want to sell something more than the people want to buy it, it affects how high or how low the prices or the cost may be. Okay, so these are some of the things we mean when we say market forces. We also look at employer policy. Organizations typically have policies, and these policies, of course, must have roots or must be offshoots of the labor law or cannot negate or be against the labor law. Then individuals too negotiate. Of course, there are some job roles in some certain organizations. The salary is fixed and is communicated. So if you're applying for that job, for example, you already know upfront if you want it, and you go through the recruitment process and you are selected, the rate is predetermined. Okay, then collective bargaining basically means a situation or scenario where typically the unions are representative of the workers, of the employees. Generally speaking, unions officials are elected. People contest or are nominated to become officials because people believe that they genuinely have the interest of the workers at heart, and then they interface with the employers of labor. Sometimes if you say all employees to individually negotiate, the process may be tedious, it may be laborious, but the union will be maybe 6 executives, 10 executives, depending on the strength of the union, and maybe every 3 years or every 2 years or every year, depending on what their their relationship is and the terms and conditions they agree to, they can negotiate. Then we also have what we call legislation. And by legislation here, it means primarily the act of parliament So a minimum wage, for example, is a legislation, because it passes through the National Assembly, both the Senate and the House of Representatives, and then the President assents to the bill. That's a legislation. Of course, a lot of things goes into that. Even houses of assemblies, National Assembly, House of Rep, sorry, they typically do hearing, public hearing, they debate on the floor, they get input from relevant stakeholders, and so on and so forth. But by and large, wage determination is a combination of all of these factors. By that, we mean combination of the interaction of market forces, employer policy, individual negotiation, then collective bargaining, legislation, and so on and so forth. And that's why, especially in the private sector, you can see that different organizations pay different rates. And even within the same organization, people may be doing about the same thing, but not necessarily in the same thing. That may, for example, be as a result of individual negotiation, which may also be as a result of maybe experience, historical earnings, and so on and so forth. So the wage is both a cost to the employer, okay, while it is an income to the employee. And that's why there's a concept we call CTC, which is cost to company. So when you're calculating, for example, maybe financial terms, the cost of employment, if you have maybe 100 staff, what is the total salary of those 100 staff? Of course, you combine other benefits, for example, HMO, welfare benefits, and so on and so forth. So, because anytime in quotes that workers are asking for more money, or for example, the union are agitating for more money, remuneration, or even HR, is trying to see how to improve the financial well-being of their staff by trying to raise revenues, raise salaries, and so on and so forth. It will almost look like this request, this intention, this desire is at loggerhead. When I say loggerhead, so in other words, you are trying to increase the cost of the organization, but don't forget that this cost you are trying to increase, all things being equal, these are the people who drive productivity, who drive revenue, who are innovative, who manage, engage, interact with the customers. Okay. But generally speaking, all organizations try to keep their salary, cost within a reasonable threshold of their total cost. In labor market analysis, okay, wages influence employment. Okay, for example, if the minimum wage is in quotes very high, employers of labor will be hesitant to hire more people. So just saying, maybe there's an assignment or a project that maybe normally 6 people should execute. If the wages are high, the employer may now try to be, should I say the word crafty, or just try to be economical. Let's use that word, and maybe try and see 4 people can do the work that normally 6 people should do, just because of the associated cost they are trying to contain. All right. So labor market analysis, wages influence employment. It also influences productivity, influences mobility, living standard, and industrial relations. So productivity, generally speaking, you will assume that the better people are paid, the more they are motivated to, do their best, work on their deliverables, solve problems for the organization, achieve results, and so on and so forth. When we talk about mobility, part of it may include, you see today, for example, in Nigeria, maybe certain job types that pay at certain ranges may be more predominant, maybe in locations like Lagos, Abuja, Port Harcourt, Kano, that kind of a thing. And you will see that people looking for employment sometimes have to move. They have to be mobile. They have to change geography just to be able to. So you see, depending on where the wages are high or relatively high, those locations will attract inflow of employees or potential workers, as the case may be. Then, of course, generally speaking, the more people earn, their purchasing power is, is increased. They are able to take care of their personal and family needs, as the case may be. And so living standards increase. Generally, too, if maybe the workers are in a community, for example, are well paid, you will have like multiplier effects. They will spend more, there will be more consumptions. The consumptions will translate to employment creation, revenue businesses, and so on and so forth. And industrial relations is, generally the situation where labor unions, employers of labor, HR managers, and relevant stakeholders engage with each other, dialogue, negotiate, discuss, of course, on things that border around how to improve the workers' condition, how to improve their remuneration, how to even improve the productivity of the organization, and so on and so forth. So this is the wage determination here. You see here the demand for labor, okay, is in red, and then the supply of labor is in green. Now you see on one axis quantity of labor, and then you see on the other axis wages. Wages, same thing as salary, remuneration, just to use slightly more contemporary terms. That means the same thing in the context of this thing. So you will see here that the higher the wages, okay, the higher the wages, the higher the supply of labor. So as the wages go up, okay, people want to make, people are trying to, you can see around this area now, because the wages are here. So people are trying to supply labor. Meanwhile, on the flip side, you can see that when the wages are low around this area, extremely low, look at the demand for labor, extremely high. Can see. So labor markets, labor demand slopes downward, firms hire more labor when wages are lower, all things being equal. Labor supply slopes upward, more people are willing to work as wages increase or rises. So the equilibrium point, so this is the equilibrium point now. I'm circling the equilibrium point here. Okay, you can see here. Of course, where demand and supply equals, where demand and supply are equal. All right, so practically speaking, excess supply can create unemployment pressure. Excessive demand can also create scarcity, okay, can create scarcity. Real markets are affected by regulations, generally, unions, informality, and so on and so forth, okay? Of course, bargaining power is also very important in this context. Now, what are the factors that generally shift wage levels? Why do market wage, why does it change? Okay, so we have the demand side drivers, then we also have the supply side drivers. Lastly, we have institutional drivers, and it's important we know some of these things. So for demand side drivers, okay, product demand and revenue. Okay, so if you are a manufacturing business or concern, and more customers, consumers are requesting for your product, what will happen? You have to increase production. Increasing production, for example, may mean, so if normally you are doing 8 to 5, you may want to start doing 24 hours. In other words, you'll be running shifts. Or maybe before you are doing Monday to Friday, then you include the weekend. Or maybe you have 2 lines, industrial lines, production lines. Maybe you will now add a 3rd production line or even a 4th production line. And sometimes, as you are increasing your production lines or as you are increasing your work shift, what happens? You need more workers, more employees to drive the production. So that's what we mean by product demand and revenue. Then the degree of technology adoption, okay, digitization, automation. So, for example, I used to know a company that was using very minimal technology in the production of their products. And then they had like 400 workers. After a while, they invested more in technology, in equips, in tools. And, some of this technology, for example, some of the things that were being done manually, maybe like bagging, capping, so on and so forth, these equipments could do it. So instead of the 600 staff they needed once upon a time, they just needed like 240. Of course, they tried to see how they could move around some of the staff to some other functions because some new roles emerged, maybe quality, additional quality assurance, quality control. Then they needed new skills, people who could actually manage, operate, maintain this equipment, and so on and so forth. So the adoption of technology and automation can also shift wages upward or downward, as the case may be, depending on is your skill still relevant and needed, and so on and so forth. Then productivity of labor. Normally, you expect that when labor is productive, well, it will translate to more revenue, more profits for the organization, and they should be able to even pay better to retain talent and compensate workers as the case may be. Then the cost of capital and inputs, and when we talk about capital, even money is capital, loan, equipment, machinery, plants, those kind of things. So these are some of the demand side drivers of wage levels. They can shift wage levels upward or downward as the case may be. With respect to the supply side, by supply, we mean the people who are making their services available, the workers themselves now, the owners of the workers. Okay, and then the infrastructure that creates the supply side, some instances. So, for example, education, skills, and certification. Okay, take a typical example. Take medical doctors, at least for now, relative to the total population of the citizens, they are not much. Not only are they not too much, a significant amount of them have also now migrated or relocated. You can see. So already I'm showing us that even the supply side, the factors and parameters, they are interrelated. Okay, so education, generally in economics, scarcity confers value. So, people who have certain level of education, some of the constraints sometimes is that, just hypothetically speaking, maybe because I'm a graduate, I may not want to do some type of jobs anymore. Why? I would think it's beneath me. Oh, I have a master's, I have a doctorate, I have a this, I have that, as the case may be. So, education, skills, and certification. Okay. People who are highly skilled, highly competent, highly certified also want to earn a premium for their skills and services, for the problems they can solve. So then the population, there are some countries or cities that they are struggling. They don't even have enough manpower, human resources. You see some countries doing migration programs intentionally, trying to attract certain type of competence and talents and capabilities to their country, while some other countries are also at the receiving end in the sense that they are the one losing their highly skilled manpower to other countries. Also affecting the supply side, is the reservation wage, minimum wage, and then living cost. Living costs. There are some cities, for example, the cost of living there is higher than in some other cities. And if people work in those kind of places, tendency is that they want to ask for more revenue, more income, so that they can survive, so that they can sustain. their family as the case may be. And then how flexible are people to relocate, to travel, to change location. So labor mobility and information also matter. Some of the institutional drivers, we've discussed some of them already. Minimum wage, okay, labor laws, all right, trade unions and collective bargaining, public sector wage policy for the civil service, the industry norms and pay benchmarking. So some of these things are important, and all of them are also important. Wages are rarely determined by one force or one factor alone. In fact, it's not just by demand side alone or by the supply side or the stational side. So it's an interaction of these three key areas and their sub areas as the case may be. All right. When we talk about wage determination through individual negotiation, I'm sure most of us can relate to this. At one point or the other, maybe in one of the places you have worked, you must have asked or be asked this question: how much do you want to earn? What are your salary expectation? And maybe they give you an offer. Yeah, maybe you write them back or call them back to try and say, oh, thank you for that offer, but it's below my expectation. This is what I'm looking at, that kind of a thing. So individual wage negotiation occurs when the employer and employee agree terms directly, often during hiring, okay, promotion, or contract renewal. The outcome depends on the employee's scarce skills, experience, performance record, alternative offers. By alternative offers, when you're talking to a candidate, chances are high that several other organizations are also engaging with them. So alternative offers, then gaining confidence. The employer's position depends on role urgency. So I'm just saying, maybe you have a role. Let me pick an hypothetical role. Maybe you have drivers now. Maybe you have 30 vehicles. Normally you should need like 35 drivers for 30 vehicles. I say 35, in case a driver falls sick, a driver is on leave. But now imagine that you now have maybe 28 drivers instead of that. You are under pressure in that context because maybe there are trucks that should be used to go and deliver what do you call it now? Goods for customers. There is truck, but there's no driver. In that context, in that scenario, I'm just using driver as an example here. So it can be for any job. So maybe there is a department or a function, maybe nobody is manning it. Maybe the last person manning it has left or served out their notice period and so on and so forth. So it can create an emergency situation, urgency. Sometimes organizations, depending on their policy, internal policy, may be slightly flexible or more flexible in this case. So role urgency, available budget, internal pay equity. By internal pay equity, in this case, almost like comparing the worth of each job relative to each other within the organizational structure and how these roles contribute uniquely to revenue, to profitability, to bottom line and top line, as the case may be. And how easy is the cost of replacements. So we see that, and this is not, I'm appreciative of all roles. I think, generally speaking, all roles are important. So please don't look at this in a condescending manner. But you will agree with me that maybe, for example, if you need a cleaner, and I don't mean an industrial cleaner, I just mean a regular, sweep the floor, clean the rooms, toilet, those kind of things. These are some things that almost everybody can do. Why? Many of us do it even domestically. So that kind of thing, because many people can do it, their salary will be maybe within a certain range. Same thing as maybe driver, because many people can drive. But when you go to something like a pilot, not many people can fly a plane because it requires more extensive training, more extensive education, more extensive certifications, and so on and so forth. So all of these things affect it. Negotiation is common, especially for executive roles, specialist occupations, contract work, scarce skills positions, and so on and so forth. So, some jobs, they will just tell you, this is the amount we are paying, X or Y, take it or leave it. And they'll probably mostly get people to do it. But there are some other roles, I'm just saying, maybe by the time you're looking for a managing director or you are looking for CFO, certain senior roles like that. Sometimes you may not just have a figure that the amount is X. It may be a range between X to Y so that you can accommodate the peculiarities of your preferred candidates. Risk includes pay inequality. These are some of the things that individual negotiation can lead to, because different people will negotiate, based on their own peculiar historical earnings, competencies, capabilities, trainings, and so on and so forth. So it can lead to inequality, may lead to bias, information asymmetry, because, of course, in quotes, salary is confidential. So different people don't know. Mr. A will not know what Mr. B is negotiating. Madam C will not know what Madam E, but when is collective bargaining or union, so to speak, they do it for the broad spectrum. So there is more information relatively available, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the challenges and peculiarities associated with individual negotiation. Some of the key concepts here, reservation wage, which is minimum acceptable wage an individual is willing to accept for a job. Anything below that which they will turn down the offer. Again, there is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. In other words, what are the options? And that's why you will see that highly skilled employees, especially in top industries, whose competencies in high demand, they may be able to command higher revenues, higher compensation wages. Why? Maybe the top 7 industry players are asking for the services of one person. You understand? It may not necessarily be in a hurry, and it can take his time, and it calls the shots. But imagine maybe this skill, maybe in the last 1 or 2 years, nobody has even asked for your service. You now get one opportunity. I don't want to use the word compromise, but you will quickly, come to terms with an agreement with whoever is trying to seek your, to give you employment opportunity, because it's almost like you are stranded. So you can see here, professionals in high demand are able to negotiate more because of their capability, of their competencies. The information asymmetry is a context where one party, has more information about maybe market pay, budget, urgency, or skills scarcity. And I've seen instances, where an employee, so to speak, is short paid. Why? Maybe they didn't even have any idea of the prevailing market rates. Maybe they were coming from another industry completely. So I don't want to mention industry so I don't make one industry better than the other. So let me use a hypothetical industry. So you are coming from industry X, where the salary range is 1 million to 2 million per year. Meanwhile, you are going to industry Y, where the salary range for that same kind of job function is 10 million to 15 million. And you don't know anybody, you didn't do your research, you didn't do your finding, and maybe I'm not asking you, how much do you want to earn in industry Y? You're at the top of your mind, if you pick the top range, you just say 2 million. Well, that's the top range from where you're coming from. And it's a far cry from the minimum range where you are going to. So, of course, a standard organization will still place you appropriately based on your competence, years of experience, and so on and so forth, and not take advantage of information asymmetry. But many organizations, not all organizations, are that, let me use the word professional. Some are also struggling. They are trying to minimize costs, especially women businesses. Pay equity, negotiated wage must still fit internal fairness, grading and equal pay principles in the organization, scarcity premium, a wage premium. So scarcity premium is, once the number of people that can do some things are not many. So anybody who is going to hire those kind of professionals, you will pay scarcity premium. A wage premium paid because the skill is rare, urgent, or hard, or difficult to replace. Let me use one maybe funny example. So, these people who maybe evacuate soakaways. I remember sometimes somebody told me how they reached out to those people. And when they got there, they said how much they wanted to take. Of course, these people, and I'm trying to show you an urgent situation, they know that the soakaway is like full or over full, and the people were hired to evacuate. And these people called a particular price and they were trying to negotiate. And when they negotiated to a certain level, the owners of the truck and the people who evacuated, they just jumped on their truck and wanted to drive away. They knew that. And of course, that particular day, the timing, it wasn't going to be easy to replace them and, those kind of things. Of course, that's just an example. Anything can determine urgency or anything can make something hard or difficult, just as the case may be. And that's why you see sometimes professionals from an individual level, they are consciously, actively looking for maybe new skills they can quickly learn so that they will have first mover advantage, they will have that scarcity premium advantage, and so on and so forth. Then total rewards, okay, which is the negotiation may include salaries, allowance, benefit, flexibility, training, and career progression. So total rewards just means the totality, all the things in quotes that an employee finds positive, in an employee-employer relationship. So of course, salary is part of it. But for example, working hours. Do you have staff boss? Do you do hybrid? All those kind of things are part of things. Do you day train? What's the frequency of promotion? And so on and so forth. So the next concept we'll look at, even though we have alluded to it already in this conversation, is the minimum wage, which is the legally prescribed lowest wage an employer can pay workers. So when we talk about minimum wage, it means that it is legislated. Okay, the National Assembly has passed and said, oh, it's 70,000 naira, for example, which means the lowest earning employee in your office. So, for lack of a better word, at least based on my limited experience, in many organizations, some of the roles that you will say maybe earn close to the minimum in many organizations, maybe like cleaner or office assistant. You understand? Those are the typically like most basic roles in many organizations. In other words, your cleaner cannot earn below 70,000. Now, it doesn't mean, so you can be paying your cleaner 150, 200, you understand? But the minimum wage wants to protect the most vulnerable in the workforce so that you will not now decide that you want to be paying, for example, 25,000. Now, of course, I know you may know people who earn way below the minimum wage, especially in the informal sector, especially in the domestic sector. So you may know somebody who is a nanny or something who does not even have a formal letter of employment. But by and large, that should not be the case. That is illegal. Okay, so it doesn't matter the person's occupation. The minimum wage is the minimum amount anybody should earn. So it is a labor market intervention designed to protect workers from wages that fall below a socially acceptable floor. So you don't want them to suffer. You don't want them to beg. You don't want them to be despondent. You don't want a station where maybe their salary is even lower than their transport costs. Those kind of things. Minimum wage may apply nationally, sectorally, regionally, or category, depending on the legal framework. In practice, enforcement is easier in formal employment than in informal or casual work arrangements. Minimum wage debates often balance worker welfare, okay, business capacity, inflation, and employment effects, and so on and so forth. Because there are arguments that oh, the minimum wage is in quote high. Why that is good for the welfare of the workers? It may discourage employers or from hiring or employing more people, and vice versa. Sometimes some organizations will argue on, oh, can we afford it, and so on and so forth. So let me give you an example. When the current minimum wage in Nigeria, as at this recording, I think it's 70,000 naira. But when it was initially done, not now, I think 2, 3 years ago, thereabouts, about 3 years ago, if my memory serves me right. So there were arguments, because in Nigeria, minimum wage is national, which means Lagos, Osun, Kebbi, Ebonyi, Kano, and so back then, I'm not talking about now, some of the states were complaining that minimum wage may be, in quotes, easy for maybe Lagos, Rivers, Kano to pay. That some of their own states, they don't have a lot of IGR. IGR means internally generated revenue, and so on and so forth. So you now have scenarios where even though the minimum wage was 70,000, for example, some states were not paying the full amount and by that I mean maybe they'll pay our salary they were owing, or they won't be able to pay, those kind of things. So that's what we mean by business capacity, institutional capacity to pay, okay, and so on and so forth. Purpose reasons for minimum wage, worker protection. We've already alluded to some of these things, but so run through it quickly. Prevents extreme wage exploitation and supports a basic standard of living. Poverty reduction, raise earnings at the lower end of the labor market when effectively enforced. Fair competition, discourage firms from competing mainly through very low wages. If you keep your wages low or excessively low, it will now let you have more profit margin. But because there's a minimum wage below which you can go, at least that is limited to a large extent. It also supports social stability. It reduces resentment associated with severe income inequality. Then demand support. Low-wage workers tend to spend earnings quickly and they support local consumption. So what we are trying to say here is that generally, people who are living earning minimum wage, you will agree with me, that we spend almost 100% of our income. In fact, the ability to save is minimal because by the time they, attend to, for example, feeding, they attend to accommodation, the money will barely be enough. So when the minimum wage is increased, people in that spectrum of the labor market, they most likely will still spend everything because of the status and their income status. So it's believed that when the minimum wage generally is increased, it leads to what we call increase in aggregate consumption and demand, which has positive impact on the organization. Okay, so there are implications for this minimum wage. Okay, for the employees, higher wage floor, which they want, we employees always want more revenue, more income, potentially improved morale and dignity. If you can afford the basic necessities of life, you are by all means happier because at least maybe if you have family, you have children, dependents, you are able to support yourself and them more comfortably, and hopefully you'll be able to put your heart to work and do better on the job. Risk of exclusion if employers reduce hiring. So these are some of the side effects. On some occasions, we've seen where when the maybe government increase the minimum wage, either some organizations will freeze employment, and where they don't freeze employment, they may even downsize, they now begin to combine or merge roles, or in some other cases, when people resign, for example, no attempt to be made to replace that role. They just reassign the task. So this can be some of the implications of a minimum wage with respect to employees. For employers, higher payroll costs. Of course, employers will almost immediately try to see how they can get the workforce to be more productive so that they can, because it's higher costs, so they want to see how they can ramp up revenue, profitability, and so on and so forth. They can also attempt to change, the way they staff, the way they price, their product and services, because they must pay workers from sales. So their product and services, they will try to see how they can quickly increase it to accommodate this increase in wages. So these are some of the things that may happen for employers and to the economy at large, like we alluded to. Minimum wage, especially an increase, can increase aggregate consumption, aggregate demand. On the flip side, it can add inflationary pressure, especially if it is not productivity linked. I remember when I was way back in school then, doing my undergraduate studies, we learned about the Idoji Award. I can't remember whether it was 1966 or 1967 or 72, but I shall know that it's either 60 or 70, I'll confirm. And the Udoji was like the name of the chairman of that panel committee that proposed that wage. And when that money came, it was good, significant increase from what workers were earning before. But the feedback is that it now led to inflation. So even the people in the market, everybody started increasing the prices of goods and salaries because they say, actually, the civil servants have been settled, that kind of a thing. So while increase in minimum wage is good, there must be intentional efforts, even at national level, state level, to ensure that there's corresponding increase in productivity so that it doesn't lead to inflation. Another challenge generally within the economy is the fact that it's one thing for the government, for the states to legislate minimum wage. It's another thing to enforce it, especially in the informal sector, owner-managed business, what we popularly call one-man businesses, domestic workers, maybe personal drivers, chefs, cooks, nannies, people who work at that level where there's almost no documentation with respect to their employment status. Okay, so positive impact is strongest where compliance is high and productivity can absorb the increase. Negative impact, risk is higher where firms are fragile. Okay, margins are thin or employment is informal. All right, so these are some of the things we have looked at. Moving on, so the economy of organization, okay, refers to the firm's financial and operational capacity to pay wages. There's something we call ability to pay. Sometimes, when you meet with business owners or business managers and you tell them that, oh, things are hard in the country economically, the staff deserve to earn more money. Most of the time, most of these business owners or business managers all agree that the employees actually deserve more. They too go to the market. They buy petrol. They go to the supermarket. They go to the import market, and so on and so forth. So it's not typically from a place of maliciousness that many companies don't want to pay better. Let me use that word. Yes, I know that a few people may be out of sheer greed. I know there may be people like that. But for many people, it's not necessarily greed, but it is about the economics of their own firm. There have been instances where some companies actually borrow money, like take an overdraft or something from the bank to pay salaries. There have been instances where the total revenue in some months could not cover the cost of operations. So these are some of the factors around the economics of the company. So firms' financial and operational capacity to pay wages sustainably. Okay, so there's instances where Some companies, they will maybe do a 50% salary review. They pay in January, they pay in February, then in March, they delay payments or are unable to pay in April. Why? Maybe their cash flow is epileptic or erratic. Or there are some products, maybe during the rainy season you sell more, during the dry season you don't, those kind of things. So you must look at your operational capacity to pay wages in a sustainable manner. Sustainable means all year round, all seasons round, all weather round. When things are good, when things are bad, and so on and so forth. So wage decisions must reflect revenue, profitability, cash flow, productivity, cost structure, and competitive strategy. Let me speak to cash flow. Okay, cash flow simply means how income enters in the organization. To make it even easier, so if you are watching this now and you have just one source of income, in other words, you work for a private organization or a government organization and they pay you salary once a month. Maybe just for example, maybe they pay you on the 30. So your cash flow is every 30th. That's your cash flow. Now, let's assume that this is another person now. Let's assume that maybe you inherited 20 properties and they are rented out. So in January, 3 tenants will pay you. In April, another 3 tenants will pay you. In your own instance, in addition to your monthly cash flow of on the 30th, you now have some other cash flows, maybe in January when your tenants pay you, or maybe you have some investments, or you have a farm, or you have shares in a place and they are paying dividends. I hope you get it. Sometimes I try to take something personal so that you can now relate it to the organization. So when do the customers of the organization, when do they pay? Are they, sometimes some of us work in organizations where some of the sales we do is on credit. Even though people come and collect the product, it doesn't mean that the organization gets paid instantaneously. Some people have maybe credit, what do you call it now? Credit relationships, maybe 30 days after, 45 days after, 60 days, especially if you're also working with third-party businesses and so on and so forth. So a strong organization may pay above market, okay, to attract and retain talent, while a fragile organization may focus on cost containment. Ability to pay does not remove the need for fairness, compliance, and minimum standards. So, you can't say because you don't have ability to pay, for example, you'll be hiring people and be paying them below minimum wage. That's illegal. That's immoral. You understand what of course, there may be specific situations, but not that on a consistent basis. You will now be setting out to hire people and be paying them minimum wage under the guise that we don't have ability to pay. You get. HR should link wage decisions to value creation, productivity, quality, innovation, customer outcomes, and risk reduction. So I hope you find that session useful. Organizational level wage determinants. Okay, I'll be faster now. We've spoken some of these things. Ability to pay. Can current and projected cash flow sustain this wage level? Productivity. Does labor output justify the wage bill? Internal equity. Will the wage create fairness or compression problems? External competitiveness. Is pay sufficient, for example, to attract and retain needed talent? For example, if you work in an organization, that organization is operating in an industry. Chances are, especially for senior roles, not entry level now, when you need workers, when you need talents, you need people who are already in the industry. Your salary range, is it something that when other people in the industry here, they want to submit their CV or come for consideration for employment? So again, if you pay below the market average, you will suffer from challenging or inability to attract talent, especially competent and senior talent. That's what we mean by external competitiveness. Pay structure. Does the grade, allowance, and benefit structure support control and transparency? Business strategy. Is the organization competing on cost, or you are competing on quality, or you are competing on innovation, or competing on service. So your business strategy, how you are competing, I don't want to mention any products, but imagine a premium brand right now, a premium brand, and you are competing on innovation, such that when you release a new product, people have to even pre-order weeks, months ahead. That's your business strategy. Chances are, because of the type of services, products you are creating, you will need extremely intelligent, maybe engineers, technicians, and the likes to keep churning and sustaining your innovation. Then your salary cannot be, in quotes, peanuts. You understand? But imagine you are doing something for the mass market, you are targeting the bottom of the pyramid, people can buy small quantity, and you try to win by selling a lot of volume. You may not necessarily be able to be the ISP, okay, based on your business strategy, how you are making money. We've spoken around collective bargaining, so let's just go through the slides. Collective bargaining is the process through which employees, usually represented by a union, negotiate employment terms with an employer or employees employer association. Wages, allowances, working hours, job security, grievance procedures, benefit and safety issues may also be negotiated. So it's not just naira and kobo. Okay, you can see here wages, allowances, working hours, job security, grievance procedures, safety issues. These are some of the other issues that may be negotiated. Collective bargaining creates a structured basis for employment relations and may reduce arbitrary wage setting. So the committee or the union and management representative, they sit down, iterate, facts and figures, back and forth, and they agree on the wages. Collective bargaining can improve voice and fairness, but may also create rigidity if not aligned with productivity and affordability. And that's why, as much as possible, especially in a transparent context, you want to provide all information, all facts, all data, so that, I've sat in a negotiation before where, and when I say in this particular negotiation, so practically now in Nigeria, sometimes you'll have negotiation at the national level. You understand? Then you now have negotiation at what we call plant or branch level. Where at the branch or plant level now is the representative of the union and the specific organization. At the national level, so maybe you have National Union of Electricity Employees. At that level, they can negotiate with all electricity organizations and negotiate something at a general level. But you will now see that NUI will now be negotiating on a case-by-case basis with Ibadan Disco, Eko Disco, Abuja Disco. Why? Apart from the general negotiated terms and conditions, the ability to pay of each disco is not the same. So if you make it general, for example, this hypothetical, it may be possible that maybe the discos managing areas in Lagos may be able to pay more than the ones in Ebonyi, just as an example. So you don't now want the one in Lagos to be paying the Ebonyi and Ebonyi to be paying the same thing when the cost of living in the two locations are not the same. You understand the differentiation between the general and then plant level, just to put some context there. Okay, so it helps to align with productivity. So in this particular branch level, I was with the organization. We showed the the union members. This is how much we made last year. This is how much we made the year before. This is how much we made the year before, the year before. Okay, based on the salary increments you are proposing, from this income, pay it. Do you get that? So we gave them fact and figure. Thankfully, there were even people in accounts, people in sales that were also union members. And look, in quotes, literally, we can pay you any amount if you can show us how to fund it. We were that transparent. So at the end of the day, even they now have to come down and maybe propose some things that if we can hit some new targets, certain bonuses, certain incentives will kick in. Why? The data was available to them. And they too had other sources to verify and confirm that It's not as if maybe management was trying to be deceitful or concealing information and so on and so forth. Now, this is the collective bargaining process. You have to prepare. It doesn't matter whether you are for the organization or management, maybe you're in HR, or even you are a union member yourself. Don't want to enter a negotiation meeting blindly. You do your research, you gather data, information, ask questions, so that you are not just using hypothetical context. For example, you are not just saying things are hard. Things are hard is what's the word now? Is a generic statement. And I know that things are hard. But when you come to negotiation, collective bargaining, you don't come and say things are hard. You'll be using data. For example, fuel is maybe 1,250 naira per liter. A plate of food in our area is 1,350. One room apartment, you understand? If you don't prepare, you won't get all this kind of data. The other one is this is how much money the company is making. You also want to show the company how, in quotes, they can conveniently afford to pay the increased negotiation you are aiming for. Okay, so there are claims, there are demands, there are negotiation back and forth. Let me just add there that, and this may speak even to negotiation in general. So normally, when the union is approaching management, this just on an aggregate level, maybe they have 10 requests, but there will be like non-negotiable requests. In those 10 requests, there may now be like 5 requests that no matter what, the union must get. Hope you are with me. Now, by the time they negotiate, maybe 3 or 4 of those requests are taken out of the 10, they now get 6. Some of the ones they get to, maybe they wanted 10 naira, but they will know that, okay, if we get 7 naira, we are fine. So, and that's negotiation. And that's why when you are negotiating, sometimes there's what we call give and take. You must know what you can trade off. You must know the ones that you will be rigid, the ones you will insist, put your foot down. And you must know. So, and all of this is from preparation to say, okay, we are approaching the union with this. You can step down on this. This is no going back on this. And you know how to throw all these parameters to the table because you want industrial harmony. You don't want a scenario, a situation where the workers will down tools. And then you come to an agreement, and then implementation will follow, and then there will be review. So you see that most collective bargaining agreements, CBA, collective bargaining agreement, typically have a duration, a tenure. So many that I've seen, maybe 3 years. It can be 2 years, it can be 5 years, you understand? Why do they try to make it 2 or 3 years? Okay. So implementation is key. Let me use an example here. I'm mentioning it because it's a public domain. You remember, for those of us familiar with ASU, there used to be, I can't remember, is it 1999 or something? There is one particular agreement that ASU and federal government claims they both had, but somehow it was never implemented. I think a few years ago, or maybe this government or the government, I can't remember exactly when, they had to renegotiate a negotiated agreement. And so sometimes agreement is good, but can need to be implemented. And from a government perspective, and it shouldn't be so normally. It's possible that maybe an administration is coming to the twilight of their tenure, and then they can, in quote, going to agree anything with the union. Why? They are leaving in 2 months' time, in 3 months' time, and then they leave. But we now say that government is what? A continuum. And the new administration will now say, oh, we can't afford this. And then the union will now be saying, but we agreed with your predecessor. What will happen in that context? There will be implementation stalemate. And that's why, as much as possible, we want things to be done as reasonably as possible so that it doesn't matter, so to speak, changing administration, changing government, those kind of things. Things can work as smoothly as possible. But there are instances where due to prevailing circumstances, maybe a dramatic change in the economy, even though we agree that the thing will be reviewed in 3 years, sometimes intentionally, certain clauses are put in the agreement. I can't remember the legal term now, but, almost like saying if there are certain factors or certain scenarios, we may call for an early review or an extraordinary uh, review, certain clauses like that, almost like a force majeure type thing so that because we've agreed 3 years and some major things happen in the economy, and then our take-home pay cannot take us home, we, use those clauses to reopen our conversation. I hope to remember the time again. So I'm now missing union now. When I was with them, it was like the hour is too much. Now that I'm no longer working in a capacity of interfacing with them, I'm now missing them. So you see, implementation then review. So it's very important to review because economic conditions change, organizational conditions change, employee conditions also change. So these are some of the critical success conditions: evidence-based wage protocol, you see, documentation, mutual respect, good faith bargaining, costing of agreements, can we do this? Is it sustainable? Clear implementation and dispute resolution mechanism, right? Very important. In conclusion, wages are determined by a combination of economic factors, okay, organizational capacity, employee bargaining power, unions, and law. Market forces explain the broad logic of wage movement, but real labor markets are shaped by imperfections and institutions. Okay, minimum wages protect workers, but require careful analysis, compliance, affordability, and employment effects. Collective bargaining creates structured employee voice and negotiated wage outcomes. And effective HR practice balance fairness, competitiveness, affordability, and productivity. So these are some questions just to ginger you and to see how much you have learned from today's session. Explain how labor demand and labor supply interact to determine wages. Differentiate individual wage negotiation from collective bargaining. Discuss 5 reasons for minimum wage loss. Evaluate the implications of minimum wage loss for employees, employers, and the economy. Then how should the economy of the organization influence wage decisions? So next, we are going to be moving into chapter 5, which is on working arrangements. Okay, so next we'll be looking at working arrangements, patterns through which work is scheduled, organized, and delivered. The learning objectives of this chapter include how to define work arrangements, explain why they matter in labor market analysis, how to identify major existing work patterns in Nigeria, how to explain shift work, overtime, part-time work, regular schedules, compressed work time, flexi time, assess the benefit and risk of different work arrangements for employers and employees, relate working patterns to productivity, well-being, compliance, and also organizational flexibility. So working arrangements basically define or describe our work time, how the location, the schedule, employment patterns, how they are structured. Okay, so say 8 to 5, for example, say 9 to 6. Okay. Some organizations and some departments do 24 hours shifts. Is it two shifts a day or 3 shifts a day? How do the shifts overlap? How do they hand over to each other? So they influence employee well-being, productivity, labor costs, service coverage, and work-life balance. In Nigeria, working arrangements vary across formal employment. Okay, informal work public service, manufacturing service, education, health, and technology sector. So you see, for example, a hospital will most likely, especially if it's a standard hospital, because sickness is not a respecter for work hours. People can fall sick anytime, and they will need medical attention. You understand? So you see that hospitality, like hotels, guests, clients can almost come in at any time. For example, that aviation, they fly almost around the clock, morning, nights, midnight, and so on and so forth. So the industry, the sector will also determine. Modern organizations increasingly combine traditional schedules with flexible and technology-enabled arrangements. The role of HR is to help design arrangements that are productive, very important, productive, that are lawful, okay, inclusive, and sustainable. So you want to factor in all the interests of the stakeholders, starting from the customers, the consumers of your product and services, to the management, owners of the business, to the workers, employees, So that word sustainability is key. Very quickly, these are some of the existing work patterns. We all know number one, regular full time. And typical context, public service, banks, schools, they typically operate regular work hours. Some of the HR issues here are attendance, productivity, engagement, and the likes. Then we have shift work, which is typically common around manufacturing. Why? Most manufacturing, for example, produce 24/7. They are running shifts, healthcare, security. In fact, there's no off-peak period. Off-peak period can even be a high-risk period. So security may even need to be heightened, at night, for example, or at weekends, transport, hospitality. What are some of the HR issues that are likely to emerge or that may need to be managed? Fatigue, handover, safety, and so on and so forth. We also have overtime, and this is where maybe projects, operational peaks, seasonal demand, there are some organizations, maybe the nature of their industry, maybe towards weekend, the demand for their services is higher, or towards the end of the month, or at certain times of the year, and so on and so forth. Some of the issues HR needs to watch out for, cost control and burnouts. Okay, then another work pattern is part-time. Okay, education, retail, consulting, casual roles. HR needs to watch out for contract clarity and proportionality benefits. We have another type work pattern which is called compressed week. Compressed week, typical context, project since professional service. So compressed week just simply means, so a normal week in quotes is say Monday to Friday. But when you do Monday to Friday, that is assuming, for example, 8 to 5. So compressed week can be Monday to Thursday, but maybe 7 to 7 on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So that your 40 hours, instead of spreading it over 5 days, you spread it over 4 days. That's just an example of compressed weeks. So you can see that project teams, professional services tend to be able to operate that kind of arrangement. Some of the things HR needs to watch out for, long day fatigue, when you work excessive hours, even though you will not rest on that extra day you are saving. We have flexi time and hybrid, typical context, knowledge work, tech environment, consulting, support roles, and so on and so forth. So some of the things we want to watch out for here, output management, and then trust. And you see that when people talk about let me work from home, one of the two main concerns in no particular order is, do we believe that this person will do the volume and quality of work they claim they will do? And the other one is, are they even working for us at all? Okay. So shift work. So we just breeze through. Shift work can divide the working day into different time blocks so that employees can cover operations, beyond normal office hours, common in hospitality, and so on and so forth. Shift may be fixed, it may be rotating day, night, or split or continuous 24-hour operations. Benefits include continuous service coverage, machine utilization, and customer availability. Risk include fatigue, sleep disruption, safety incidents, family strain, poor handover between shifts. Please pay attention to that. As HR, you must put an extra eye on the handover between shifts. That's why maybe mistake or errors can tend to be high. How do you manage shifts effectively? The way you design it. You want to predictable rosters as much as possible, adequate rest period, fair rotation rules, so that maybe staff don't manipulate it or some people victimize others. Watch out for health and safety, fatigue monitoring, meal and transportation support, incidents reporting, performance tracking, clear handover notes, supervisor coverage, output standards, and so on and so forth. Night shifts may require additional security, transport welfare safeguard, especially in urban communities. Okay. So overtime working, we'll look at that a little more too now. So overtime occurs when employees work beyond the standard work hours agreed by contract. So typically it means you have done your normal work. So maybe your normal work hours is 8 to 5. Then maybe you now have to work 2, 3, 4 hours additionally, maybe from 5 to 8. Is that extra work that is overtime? Okay, so it may be used to meet urgent deadlines, seasonal demand, absenteeism gaps, equipment breakdowns, or project peaks. Overtime can be voluntary. It can also be compulsory. Okay, but one thing is important. Almost in all instances, overtime is paid at a higher rate than normal work hours. So if, for example, this is hypothetical, you pay people 1,000 naira per hour for working. So when you work 8 to 5, so 8 to 9, 1,000, 9 to 10, 1,000. For the overtime, maybe which is 5 to 9, for example, you may now be paying 1,500 naira per hour. Note, these people have done normal work. So normally they should be tired or they should go home. They are now working extra. So that's why it commands a paid premium rate, which is higher. Sometimes it's compensated through time off in lieu, depending on the organizational policy. HR must monitor overtime costs, fairness, approval controls, fatigue, and productivity decline. Okay. Excessive overtime may indicate understaffing, poor planning, weak processes, or unrealistic workload design. So I need us to pay attention to that. Excessive overtime, which means if overtime is now every day, continuously, that's what we mean by excessive now. It may show that maybe you don't have enough staff in the first place, or you are not planning as an institution, okay, or your processes is faulty, or the workload design, something somewhere is not gelling. It can be any of these things or a combination of all of these things. So nobody should pride in permanent overtime. Something somewhere is not sustainable. Yes, you pay your employees a premium, but it may be at the expense of their health over time. So part-time work involves working fewer hours than a comparable full-time employee within the same organization or role type. It is useful for roles with limited workload, peak hour demand, student employment, specialist consulting, and phase retirement. Advantage includes labor cost flexibility, access to specialized talent, and support for work-life balance. Risk include reduced commitment, scheduling complexity, weaker inclusion, and unclear benefits. A written agreement should specify hours, pay basis, duties, reporting line confidentiality, and data protection obligations. Then we have regular schedule. I'm tempted not to speak to this, but just in case. Regular schedules are fixed, predictable work patterns such as Monday to Friday or a standard office day arrangement. They are common in public service, corporate, and so on. Benefits include predictability, easier supervision, team coordination, routine customer service planning, for example. Limitations include reduced flexibility, okay, commuting pressure, difficulty covering extended service hours. Regular schedules work best where output, customer needs, and collaboration patterns are relatively stable. Compressed work week, okay, it allows employees to complete standard work hours over fewer days, like I mentioned earlier, usually through longer daily hours. Examples include 4 longer work days. Okay, benefits include reduced commuting days, improved personal time, and possible facility cost savings. This include fatigue from longer work days, childcare constraints, reduced daily operation, reduced daily productivity, service coverage gaps, and so on and so forth. It is most suitable where work can be planned by output rather than continuous daily presence. Then flexi timing allows employees to start and finish times with agreed boundaries while meeting required work hours or output. Okay, so it is usually includes core hours of collaboration and flexible bands for arrival and departure or remote work. Benefits includes better work-life balance, lower lateness, improved retention, responsiveness to commuting realities. Okay, you can see some of the challenges associated. So you see that there is no perfect work arrangement. All work arrangements have their benefits and their constraints. So of course, depending on the situation of the organization or the situation of the employees, you may prefer one type to the other, and it may be in the phase of your life, All right. Risk include coordination problems, perceived unfairness, abuse of flexibility, and weak performance tracking. Effective flexi time requires trust, clear deliverables, common communication rules, and reliable performance management. Okay, this is a summary of all of the work arrangements we've discussed: the shift work, the overtime, part-time, regular schedule, compressed week, flexi time. So this is showing you everything at a glance in one go. So you can see where they are best used for, and you can see the main risk to manage. All right, so all of this we have discussed so far in this session. So as we conclude, ladies and gentlemen, work arrangements shape the practical experience of employment and the cost of labor utilization. No single arrangement is best for all organizations. Suitability depends on sector, role type, service demand, and employee needs. Nigerian organizations must design work patterns with attention to safety, commuting realities, family responsibilities, and compliance. HR should evaluate arrangements using productivity, cost, employee well-being, inclusion, and customer outcomes. Effective work design supports both organizational performance and also decent work. So these are some review questions for you. Of course, we have discussed everything in this session. I want to identify 6 existing work patterns in Nigeria and states where it is commonly used. I just showed us that. Discuss the benefit and risk of shift working. Why can excessive overtime be a sign of poor workforce planning? Compare part-time work, compressed work week, and flexi time. What HR controls are needed for flexible working arrangements? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. I think this is a good point to call it a wrap. We'll continue again at another time. Thank you so much.